All right, so I'm sitting here with Desmond, better known as Stranglebat on the internet, but this is the gentleman who took the Perth, Western Australia regional. So how are you doing?
Yeah, very good. Pretty happy with the win and pretty happy with how everything's been going.
Oh yeah, much congratulations. That must have been extremely difficult.
It was a pretty long day, I'll give it that. It's about 9 hours of Destiny in the end. And there's a pretty strong meta over in Perth, even though we're the second most isolated capital city in the world. Have quite a few people that show up and play pretty regularly to a high level, so it's good to take it out.
Okay, so first of all, tell us, why did you pick Yoda Hondo over any of the other decks in the current meta?
Well, Yoda Hondo is kind of playing to my strengths. My original favourite deck of Awakenings was Po Ray, and it does a lot of the same things as far as action cheating and special chaining and being able to, see a few actions down the chain and get a result I want. Something that I'm been able to do for a while in this game, and so this was the type of deck that let me do that. Additionally, it was also a very flexible deck with multiple win conditions and can play to any situation.
After you had seen the meta, and you know that there's mid-range, mill, aggro, what were you putting in this deck to help you counter that, since you're inherently squishy?
Yeah, so inherently it is very squishy. There is a lot of mitigation that's hits multiple dice is like the number one thing I was looking for. And then on the top of that, playing the normal complement of Force Illusion and Second Chance. Since you've got so much money, you can afford to play some of the more premium and expensive ways of removing dice like Entangle and not have it impact your game plan of finishing off the opponent. Other than that, you put in a few silver bullet type upgrades that sort of serve different purposes depending on the matchup. So against all the 3 character matchups, Force Wave was really big for me. And against the shieldy type matchups, you've got your handcrafted light bow, and then against most other matchups, Cunning is the bread and butter.
Yeah, so tell us about some of your good matchups from the day and some of your tougher matchups.
So the good matchups I had a fairly good matchup against anything that was 2 characters and trying to shield a lot. So Obi Maz, I believe I won that round in about 8 minutes off the back of 9 unblockable damage by copying Obi Sabers.
Oh!
But the harder matchups were the matches where people were trying to do the same thing I was. So I actually lost round 2 to a Poe Ayla, and those sort of matchups just come down to player skill and errors. And so I know I made a particular error in that one where I could have kept my Hondo alive, and I missed the fact that I could have copied the Ayla special to blank one of his dice, and it just costs you.
Can you expand upon that statement when you're saying, like, other decks that are trying to do what you're trying to do, since you've got so many different conditions? Like, when you came up against the Poe Ayla, like, what are you both shooting for in that situation?
In that one, we're both trying to get our upgrades down and both trying to use our consistency to eliminate the other person. That matchup always comes down to that for me. Whoever gets into the more commanding board states tends to stay that way, and then the other person starts having to contribute all their resources into removing damage rather than like advancing their own board state. And so in that one in particular, he was pretty clever. He played around the fact that I had an early Cunning and didn't put any special weapons down, and instead opted to go for the more beatdown oriented approach with the heirlooms, and he just kept his money reasonably well so he could pay when he needed to, and that slowed me down just enough where when I make a mistake he capitalized.
So that leads into another interesting thing about Hondo. How do you feel about players understanding how to counter him? Because he's got a very powerful effect, but if you make enough money to pay him off, he kind of gets neutralized the later the game goes. Do you feel like people understand how to combat that, or he's still kind of a threat in the meta right now?
I think he's still a threat. It depends on how I've been playing the match. So if I see someone that gets an early stockpile of money, I'm very likely switching to the mill plan, because I'm not necessarily going to reliably get enough damage out, and they're going to keep paying me to survive. So you put all that money into mitigating their damage and trading damage away, and then, before they know it, they realize that they've lost most of their deck and, they're down to their last hand. But the whole point of the deck is to sort of push people into a no-win situation with him. Either they pay him and I advance my game plan, or they don't pay him and they take a boatload of damage.
Now, you said that you can switch gears with this and turn it into a mill deck. Did you have any successful mill victories in the tournament?
Yeah, my fourth round was actually versing a Palpatine player, and I did manage to mill him out. It was pretty early on I decided to go for the mill because he managed to play an Indomitable. He had a few healing spells go off, like a Rise Again, and he was at full life with 3 shields at the start of round 3. It just wasn't going to win it in that way. But at the same time, he'd played a Premonitions, which got an extra card out of his hand, and I managed to mill the second one, discard rather. And it just seemed like the right tactic against Palpatine, despite the fact that he has very scary dice. So the big thing that helped me in that one actually was the fact that he was running cargo hold, and so when I got my early lone operative down, I kept switching cargo hold between my characters and healing with whoever needed it.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it hadn't come up in testing, but I was happy to make use of it.
So I'm looking at your tournament report here, and I'm noticing you faced off against some other very interesting decks like Obi-Maz and the OTK variants. How do you deal with those, considering those are going to be heavy shields with Obi-Maz, and the OTK decks are just high burst? I know you said you used Obi's own lightsaber against them, but if they decided not to play that, or if you saw it more often in the cut, how are you able to get around just so much heavy shielding or so much explosive damage coming out of OTK?
Well, both those decks, they sort of operate on a similar axis as far as they want to get their big upgrades out and then just force damage down you. OTK especially will do that. Once they get one upgrade, if they hit any of their unexhaust or ready character abilities, they can easily drop one of your 2 characters turn 1, turn 2, and that's obviously going to be a huge blowout for the deck, because good part of it is spot yellow or plat yellow only, or spot blue and blue only. So you really need both of them to stay alive for at least 3 rounds. So where I operate there is I try to limit their upgrades by forcing the Hondo specials and getting them to pay me. If they don't pay me, they're well on their way to dying. So that's kind of how I look at it. I do run my own Obi Saber, so if I need the unblockable damage, that's always going to come out eventually as well.
So let's go over the top cut, top 8, top 4, and the finals, and just give us a recap of what the deck was, what you saw on the table, and how you beat that specific deck.
Okay, so my top 8 matchup is against a vehicles deck, Ayla, Rose, Ezra, and that I won 2-zip. First match was actually pretty quick and in my favour. I did get out an early Force Wave and Cunning, and so by turn 2, turn 3, I'm resolving double Force Wave specials, and didn't last long after that. The second round was a lot closer. So the big problem with vehicles, as far as my deck's concerned, is they can be afford to be paying me while still pushing out vehicles every turn with rally aids, and so you really have to shut that down. I actually mulligan my whole hand in every match just to try and hit the early vandalize, and I got it both games. So that was a huge help for that. And then after that, you just sort of keep going through your hand so you can get to those force waves to try and shut down the 3 characters. You really have to be knocking off Rose turn 2 at the latest to be ahead of them. The other big threat that the vehicles deck has is C-3PO, and again, Vandalize is what comes up good there. So I was able to close out the game. The second game did go to about round 5, but it was a lone operative on Yoda and a cunning on Hondo that kept them alive, just sort of increasing their overall health to the point where he couldn't just indirect damage me down. The top 4 match was against Zeb, Ray from Awakenings. So that one was also pretty scary. It kind of works a lot like Sabine Ezra in the fact that it'll action cheat out and just try to resolve a whole load of damage where you can't respond to it. It plays the running interference as well as a whole load of ambush weapons, so it can pretty reliably trigger running interference to stop you removing stuff. That I also won 2-0, but I think that matchup is probably a bit closer as far as if they roll big, you're not going to recover. So you have to try and get the running interference off the board again, and the unblockable damage actually helps a lot there, but what actually helped me the most in that match was the impulsives, being able to cheat around and play impulsive on a double focus to put down the surprise amount of damage when they weren't ready for it was what let me end Zeb in both games before they could get a second chance down. And my last match was actually against Qui-Gon Ayla, which was, a fairly toothy deck as well. It had a lot more shields than the Obi-Wan deck, and so it was a bit more of a grind. I actually lost the first round of this one. I didn't actually see an upgrade till round 3. That was probably worst case scenario for me, and it was still a reasonably competitive game, but I could tell early on that I was going to lose that one. Went to round 2, and it was the opposite affair. Like, I got everything I needed real early, and by the end of round 2, I had a light bow, a cunning, a force illusion, and a second chance out, and to his dead Qui-Gon and naked Ayla. And then the third game was a little bit more in between for both of us, so went quite a way. It actually nearly came to a mill for him as well. I had him down to his last 3 cards in hand and no deck, just through playing the game and surviving, but I managed to find a window to deal the damage, and I decided just to take it rather than go for the fancy mill.
Cool. That's a really impressive, especially... I'd love to hear more about the Qui-Gon Ayla. What does that deck do?
So it's a fairly standard blue upgrade deck. He did have it binds all things out turn 1 every game, which was really good for him. It meant he could play his Shotos and Ancient Sabers and still have money to sort of mitigate some of my damage. But other than that, the big surprise damage out of that deck was coming from his ability to play Heightened Awareness, which will put 3 shields on with ambush. And, he had a fair amount of money making in the deck if he had an early It Binds All Things. And so with the Heightened Awareness into Riposte, you're looking at 4 damage out of hand with Qui-Gon if he already had a shield. It's actually quite scary. You have to be mindful of it all the times, and that's why I always had my second chance and Force Illusions down early. I wasn't waiting to try and bait him into anything. I just sort of kept it in my head to play it as soon as I can because I don't want to be caught out. And then he also did manage to make use of Atari Strike and a couple of other damage out of hand spells while making sure that he kept defenses up with his shields.
Very interesting. So some of the cards you have in your deck that we haven't particularly seen across the board. So you talked about most of these: Force Wave, Impulsive, and Rebel. These are the things that are kind of popping out because they're not exactly standard in the Yoda Hondo deck list. Why did you put these in over, other things? Especially, people are using things like Into the Garbage Chute. I know you have 2 characters with impactful dice, but they're still bringing that in just in case there's like a lethal damage showing and they can just turn off the character that would have died to eat 2 dice. Like, why these 3 cards over, these standard selections?
So as far as the rest of my removal goes, I had the Easy Pickings, Entangle, and Overconfidence all that hit 2 dice. I didn't feel like I needed the Into the Garbage Chute. So the Rebel played a big part in that. Rebel was pretty much always on. It's the one of the cards I actually thought was kind of a no-brainer for the deck, since both characters have discard sides and nearly all of the upgrades have discard sides. It was very, very, very easy for me to turn on, and I played pretty much every card in my deck twice throughout the day. I could comfortably throw away or discard to reroll a Hyperspace Jump and then later on Rebel it back, as discarding to reroll with Hyperspace Jump doesn't remove it from the game like like playing it does, and that caught a few people by surprise. Even played the 0-cost Impulsive out of my discard pile with Rebel to put it onto the Force Speed special, which gives you 3 actions, 2 from the speed and 1 from the ambush, which is kind of like a 1-cost 3 steps ahead. And I was never even unhappy just replaying a Entangle or a Easy Pickings when the situation arose. It sort of made my removal suite a bit more toolboxy as far as the late game goes. Plus, also playing 4 second chances is really good still.
Yeah, it's interesting that Rebel is one of the few cards that allows you to utilize your graveyard as an extra game zone, you could say, similar to Sabine, except instead of utilizing your upgrades, you're able to use anything, and you reduce the cost by 1. I mean, that's really good. And because people aren't used to it, they don't look at a discard and think, okay, what can they play from their graveyard for 1 less?
Yeah, and that tends to be what catches people out, is the cheeky Rebel riposte, which will then, kill one of their characters when they've still got shield sides showing on the table and things like that they don't think to, play around. Just any removal being utilized at any time, and even getting back an upgrade that I might have overwritten or had vandalized that I feel is really important to finishing the matchup. I sometimes pulled back things like a Lone Operative or a Light Bow because they've shielded up or because I've started taking more damage than I was comfortable with. And so just having that option there all the time, it made me a lot more free with my cards in the early game. And
tell us a little bit about why you decided to put Force Wave in as one of your big damage upgrades.
Well, Force Wave took the slot I think a lot of other Yoda Hondos have Force Throw. They're trying to play a bit more of a control game, whereas I was trying to be a bit more dynamic with it. Plus, in our West Australian meta, there's a lot of different decks, and it's not like some of the other ones where you see people all conforming. It's more like people will have their baby and they'll play that to the best of their ability, and so it means there's a wide range of decks you have to combat, and a big part of that is those 3 character lists. We've got a couple of dedicated mill players, a couple of people that were really hammering the Ayla vehicles lists, and there's even 1 5-die villain, which is still fairly impactful with the Mother Talzin focusing. And so Force Wave was really instrumental in being able to beat those decks. It also being a upgrade that deals damage is very nice, because a lot of people sort of figured out with the earlier Hondo Yodas that you can just remove the Light Bow or the Obi Saber and it's not dealing much damage. But the Force Wave actually adds to that, and there's a lot of tricks you can do with Yoda to sort of take away from the drawback, I guess, as far as versing other 2 character lists. You can use the special to gain a shield, special chain, then deal the damage and then soak that 1 damage to yourself with that shield. So it's really a 5-for-1, which is always a good value in my book.
Yeah. So when you got this to the table, what are some of the MVP plays or MVP cards that you think really helped get this deck from, 0 wins, 0 losses at game 1 all the way to winning the entire regional?
Probably the biggest 2 cards, you already touched on one, is Rebel. Being able to Swiss Army knife my discard in the late game is really what helped me close out a lot of matches. The other one was Impulsive. I see a lot of other people say, you should play fast hands, etc. But Impulsive is kind of hidden information, whereas fast hands, you can always see it on the table, and it allows you to resolve a few more dice. And so a lot of the plays that I was playing with Impulsive were either playing it on the, say I roll out Yoda and I have 4 speed special and a 2 focus and whatever. I then can Impulsive the 4 speed special for 3 actions, roll in the Hondo with all his upgrades, then with the second action focus 2 dice, 2 specials, and then resolve specials and hit 3 to 4 specials all as a surprise in 1 action.
Wow.
And that's what closed a number of games. It's just the fact that people couldn't really play around whether I had Impulsive in my hand or not, or Rebel and then just playing it out of my graveyard.
Yeah, I love reanimation stuff just because, when you have your deck in your hand, that's good. When you have your deck, your hand, and your graveyard, especially the later the game goes, your graveyard is bigger than your deck, which means you have more stuff to play with. And, you have to account for 3 different zones of cards, which is very difficult to do.
It is. And the Impulsive actually helped enable my Rebel as well, because a couple of matches where it looked like Hondo was going to die, he's on 9 life, they've got lethal showing, I was able to Impulsive a Yoda special to flip one of my dice to a discard, and then with the extra action play the Rebel to get a second chance back. And that happened a lot.
That is brutal.
Yeah, there's a lot of plays out of Impulsive that just didn't really come to light until we started testing with it, and after that I just could never cut that card from that deck, not with the amount of die turning specials and focuses it has in it.
Yeah, I was actually just about to ask, tell us how you figured out that combination of Rebel and Impulsive, because that's not something a lot of people are playing, or I don't know if we're even quite aware of it right now, and you not only found it, but you found it to great success.
Oh, it's kind of come about reasonably naturally. I was always going to play Rebel in the deck. Like I said, there's a lot of discard faces, and having in the past played Rebel heavy decks, because there's the Jin Urso decks and all that back in the day before they'd nerfed the ammo belts, utilised Rebel pretty well. And so I felt this was sort of in the same sort of vein as far as the way it likes to defend itself. The Impulsive came along afterwards, after I cut the Fast Hands. It just felt Fast Hands is good if you're expecting a lot of mitigation from people, but I was actually not. I was expecting a lot of damage side mitigations, and that's how it panned out as well in our meta. I mean, the number one hated card for me was actually Easy Pickings as well during the day, because I roll a lot of specials. But even outside of that, there was not really much that affected me. The Hasty Exit doesn't really get me. Into the Garbage Chute doesn't really get me. All those sort of cards, they're just, I can ignore them, so I don't need to roll out and resolve the focus. I mean, disrupt or resolve one of my specials, so that I have to get my dice off the board before someone mitigates them. I can just play them, roll out, and then play Impulsive to flip something to unexpected faces. I believe the first interaction I was actually looking at before I went down the rabbit hole and making sure Rebel and Impulsive work together and all that was actually just using Impulsive on Hondos to disrupt to take away their money and resolve like another Hondo special and maybe a Cunning, because bankrupting them and dealing 6 damage is always going to be good as well. Usually the drawback of trying to do that is you disrupt them and then they resolve resources and then you don't really get anywhere, whereas Impulsive lets you do it all at once.
Yeah, that is very cool. So now that you've won the regional and you've gone forward since then, would you make any adjustments to the deck?
Well, Rivals wasn't legal, so I'd definitely find room for Hidden Motive. I think that card's going to be pretty ubiquitous in the coming meta. It's just really good. Probably one of the lesser played cards in my deck was the Singleton Mislead, which was kind of in there just as a, I don't care if either characters die. I've still got a card I can play with my Rebels or out of hands that can remove dice. But that would easily become a Hidden Motive, and I would probably actually drop another Overconfidence as well, because 1 is still good, but 2, sometimes I didn't play the second one. I was more worried about my spot yellow removal, which was far more effective. And then again, just adjusting to the meta, if I found there was going to be a lot of 2-character heavy hitter lists like Obi-Wan, Maz, and that was all I was expecting, those Force Waves probably would become Force Throws again.
Okay. If someone listens to this and they go, man, I really want to play Yoda Hondo, but, I'm not entirely sure what I'm supposed to do with this, like, what are some pieces of advice you would give to that person?
You have to play a lot of games. That's this is the same with any deck. There's a sufficient amount of mental load on playing a deck that can cheat, 2 or 3 or sometimes even 4 actions ahead, and actually just getting the result you want without spending yourself. And so the more games you play with it, the more you've seen every situation, and some things might come up that you don't realise again, like the cargo hold with Lone Operative, but you'll know instinctively in most situations what you have to do to get the result you want, rather than having to come up with it on the fly. The other thing I would do is I would really try to play a lot of games in the meta that you're going to play in, mainly because it is a deck that rewards knowing how other people's decks tick and being able to slot in the cards you need to take away their staple cards that they're going to need to resolve to win their game plan and their matchups.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, and big congratulations on the regional win. How many people were at the event?
There was 23 at our event. Our meta's probably got about 40 people in it, but quite a few of them have jobs, so they can't come on the weekend. And there's a few more newer players that decided they weren't up for that level of competition yet. But even so, 23 is a fairly good turnout for our smaller city. And it was a really good day for us.
Excellent. Well, congratulations to you and everyone who showed up. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you everyone for listening. We will see you next time, and may the force be with you.